We are in chapter 5, section 3, and we're talking about kind of an overview of chemical reactions that are going to be important for biology and that kind of thing. So one thing I kind of wanted to talk about that I forgot to talk about in the last section was that when we have reactions, right, we have our reactant and it goes to our product. Whenever we have a catalyst, an enzyme, something like that, that is going to catalyze or speed up that reaction, what we do is we take the name of the catalyst, and it's not a reactant, it's not a product, so we don't put it on one side or the other side of the arrow. We either put it above the arrow or below the arrow. And it doesn't matter, either one is fine, but around the arrow. The same thing is true about temperature. So if I increase the temperature, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that. And one way that you can say that is with a triangle. A triangle is telling me that I have a high temperature, right? So things can be written above the arrow that don't necessarily get used in the reaction. So that's one thing to kind of remember, that those things can go up there. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 different kinds of reactions that occur and that are really important for biology and chemistry. So the 3 are synthesis reactions, decomposition reactions, and exchange reactions. And we're going to talk about each one in turn and look at some examples. So when we have a synthesis, when you think I'm going to synthesize something, I'm going to create something, right? So you're going to have some smaller molecules that are going to combine, and they're going to create a large molecule. So synthesis usually requires energy. Think about if you got a lot of little stuff, right? They have a lot of free energy because they can organize all randomly and weirdly, and there's all kind of different ways that they could be, right? But then when you go and make one product, it's got to be that one product. It has to be in that order, in that orientation to be that product. So our reactants that were all over the place and all kinds of combinations and orders and things like that are super random, and then our product is not so random. And so that means that it has, our reactants have lots of entropy, so that disorder, and our product has less. And so these kind of reactions tend to require energy, right? Because we don't want to go from a lot of small things to one big thing. That's not easy. We have to put energy in to make it happen. So a lot of times we're going to have to input something to make it happen. So here's my example, right? My example is that I'm going to use letters, lots of individual small letters, and I'm going to rearrange them and put them together to make one product. So can anybody guess what my one product is? I thought that was kind of cute. Science, right? I rearranged my letters. So I started with a bunch of little letters and I rearranged them and I put together one product, and that product is a word. And that one word is science. It has to be in this order in order to be science. And so that's why it has less disorder. So that you can see there are lots of possible ways that I could have written these reactants in all kinds of different orders and things like that. But there's only one way to write science. So that tells you about randomness, right? All right, the next one, decomposition reaction. In a decomposition reaction, we're going to go basically the opposite direction. We're going to break apart large molecules into smaller molecules. So if I started with science and went to all my letters, that would be a decomposition. I would break down the word into a bunch of little letters. And so when these kind of reactions occur, when decomposition occurs, usually we give off energy because the disorder is increased, and there tend to be stronger bonds in the products and the reactants. And we might talk about that later. So typically when you're looking to try and classify, is this decomposition, is this synthesis? Decomposition is going to start with one reactant, remember we talked about this last time, and go to multiple products. So what does hydrogen peroxide decompose into? It decomposes into water plus oxygen gas. And so we're starting with one product and making multiple, we're starting with one reactant and we're ending with multiple products. So a synthesis and a decomposition are basically the reverse of each other. So in the synthesis reaction up here, right, we started with many reactants and we went to a single product. All right, the other kind of reaction that you can have is an exchange reaction. Sometimes you'll hear this called as a displacement. When I learned it, it was a displacement reaction, but you can also call it an exchange reaction. And so this involves both synthesis and decomposition. And so there are two kind of examples of an exchange reaction. So if we have A plus BC, so what I can do is I can separate BC, can break it apart. So that's a decomposition. And then I can make something new with the parts. Whoa. So what I can do is I can do now A, C plus B, right? So I'm putting them in a different order. I'm rearranging them. So I decomposed BC and I synthesized AC. So that's why they call it a synthesis and a decomposition. You could have a little more complicated where you're starting out with two products that have two different things at least in them. So usually what happens is this is a metal and a non-metal, a metal and a non-metal. And what we do is we basically exchange. So the metal from one pairs up with the non-metal from the other, and our metal from the first will pair up with the non-metal from the second. So you end up with something that is AD plus CB. Okay. So we basically broke apart CD, so that's our decomposition. We broke apart AB, that's decomposition. We made AD and we made CB. So they're both synthesis and decomposition. So let's look at some examples. So let's start with synthesis. So an example of synthesis is protein formation, right? We have these individual amino acids. And so to make a protein, you got to get all these amino acids and you got to line them up in the right order and arrange them. And so you're taking a lot of small things and going to one big thing. That's a synthesis. Okay, decomposition. So if we eat plant material like lettuce, something like that, potatoes, right? It contains starch. And so our bodies will break down the starch into glucose because starch is really just a chain of glucose molecules. And so our body can break one off at a time, right, and make glucose molecules. And so that's decomposition. We're going from one big thing to lots and lots of little things. Then here's an example of an exchange. So this is an example of using a hydrochloric acid, using magnesium hydroxide to neutralize hydrochloric acid. So magnesium hydroxide is an antacid that helps to prevent heartburn. You know, in your stomach, you actually have hydrochloric acid. It's pretty strong stuff. And then if that acid comes up, basically your esophagus, that's what causes heartburn. So if we can neutralize the acid in your stomach, then you don't feel and we call it heartburn, but it's really not the heart, it's really the esophagus. So how is this an exchange reaction? Gosh, I got a all right. So we look at our HCl, right? Now what happens to my HCl? I'm going to break it apart. Let me go and look on the other side of the equation and look for the hydrogen and look for the chlorine. So here's my hydrogen, here's my chlorine. Do you see how it got broken apart and one went to one new product and one went to the other new product? Let's look at our other, what do we do? Let's do green, right? Here we have magnesium and we have hydroxide. So here's our magnesium and here's our oxygen, right? And you also have hydrogen in there too. So what you can see is you've made two new products and you've broken them down two reactants. So that's an exchange. Okay, maybe if I can get it to go. All right, so we can use kind of these general reaction schemes to show what's going to happen in synthesis. So in a synthesis, you're going to take pieces and make a whole. So here in synthesis, I start out with two things and I end up with one. So in synthesis, you're going to have one product. That's important, one product. In decomposition, we're going to go the other way, right? We're going to have one reactant and it's going to go to two products. So let's write that. We have one reactant, okay? And then in an exchange, that's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to exchange, right? So in the first one, AB plus C goes to AC plus B. What exchanged? The B and the C exchanged. And then if you look in the second one, AB plus CD goes to AD plus CB. Well, okay, what happened? What exchanged? Well, we had A and C exchange, and then we had B and D, right? So that's our exchange. So we ended up with AD and CB. Okay. All right, so let's look at some real reactions, and we're going to identify is it synthesis, decomposition, or exchange. So in this case, I'm looking here, and I have iron and oxygen. So if I go on the other side of my arrow and I go find iron and oxygen, let's see what happened to iron and what happened to oxygen. So I broke apart FeO3, right? And now I've exchanged and I've put my oxygen with my carbon. So my oxygen went over and is now hanging out with my carbon. So this would be an exchange. Okay. Here, this is something you should look at and you should go, oh, look at this. I have one reactant, reactant, reactant. And then I have multiple products. So it's not always going to be two products, but it will always be, for this kind of equation, one reactant. So if you're going from one thing to many small things, this is going to be a decomposition. Okay. Now H2 plus I2 goes to HI. Oh, here's different. I have one product, and here I have multiple reactants. Okay, so that is going to be, I'm going from little pieces to something whole, so I'm like basically building something. So this is going to be synthesis. All right. So now we need to talk about reversible reactions. Up until now, we've basically said reactants go to products. That's it, game over. But that's not true. A lot of reactions are reversible. So once you form the product, you can go back and make more reactants, and then you can make more products. And then you can go back to the reactants and back and forth, right? So in order to do this, right, you have to make and break bonds, and all that takes is an input of energy. So if you are able to put enough energy in, you can either break or form a bond. So you can go back and forth between reactants and products. So when we write a reversible chemical reaction, we're going to indicate it with a pair of arrows. And apparently PowerPoint didn't like my pair of arrows. And so it made this weird E, and I don't know what that is. So go in and just erase that E, right? And let's fix it. So we want a pair of double arrows. So what that means is I'm going to have one arrow. It's like half of an arrow pointed in one direction. And then my other arrow points in the other direction to show that I can go from reactants to products. So I can go that way. or I can go from products to reactants. Either way can happen. So you can kind of think about this like a sports game, right? Like a basketball game. You can only have a set number of players on the court at a given time. So if somebody gets injured, gets fouled out, whatever it is, they're going to leave the court and they're going to go to the bench, right? But what happens when one person comes off the court is that there was a group of people sitting on the bench. Somebody can come off of the bench and join the court, right? So then let's say they just needed a break. They were just tired, right? So they needed a break. So they left the court, they went on the bench, somebody from the bench came out. Oh, he's got his wind back, he's ready to go. Now they're gonna swap again. So it's just kind of a back and forth. I can't believe I made a sports reference. That's kind of awesome. All right. So, oh, and make sure you go in and you fix this one too, right? So this is another example of a reversible reaction. So get rid of this. I don't know why it did that. No idea. Okay. And we're going to draw our reversible. We're going to go back and forth. Okay. All right. So if we go in the forward, what is called the forward direction. So if you are going in this forward direction, that is going to have A and B come together to make AB. Once you make enough AB, you're going to have such a high concentration of AB that the reverse reaction is going to happen. So this is, let me zoom in, this is forward. This is the reverse reaction, okay? So when you get enough AB being formed, what's going to happen is the equation is the reaction is going to shift, and we're going to start making products. We're going to start making reactants, right? Here are reactants. Here are our products. So you're going to go in the forward direction. You're going to make your product AB. You make enough product AB, then you're going to go in the reverse and you're going to make the reactants AB, A plus B. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So when the two reactions, the forward reaction and the reverse reaction, are happening at the same rate, the reaction is said to be in a state of equilibrium. Now be careful with that statement. A lot of people confuse that with meaning that there are equal amounts of reactants and products, and that is not true. So I want you to think about that sports analogy, right? So we had players who were on the court and we had players that are on the bench. Are we always going to have equal numbers of players on the court as on the bench? No. We have to have a set number of players on the court, right? But usually you have more players on the bench waiting just in case. So when the rate of players leaving the court going to the bench equals the rate of players leaving the bench and going to the court, that is equilibrium. It's a rate. So you can't change the number of players on a court at any given time, but you can look at the rate. So how often a player leaves the court and goes to the bench, and how often a player leaves the bench and goes to the court. Okay, so be careful with concentration or amounts and rates. They're not the same. They're not the same. All right, so there are some reactions that while theoretically they could be reversible, they are not. So reactions that are highly exothermic, that give off lots of energy, like combustion, they're considered irreversible. You can't go reverse direction. So the reason why is, right, when you think about when you're combusting something, a lot of times what you're making a gas. Well, where does that gas go? It goes out into the atmosphere and it's gone, and that's it. You can't get it back. So if you can't get it back, you can't put the pieces back together in order to reform the reactant, right? So the combusted materials have gone too far and it takes too much energy to bring them all back. So combustion reactions are irreversible. So if you think about an explosion or something like that, right? We can't reverse that. You can't put together all the little pieces of ash and all the carbon dioxide in the air. It's not going to happen. So, you can't go backwards. The same is true about combustion inside of our bodies, right? Once we break down the food that we eat, we are never going to reform that food. Like that wouldn't work for us very well, right? But it's going to, when we break down the food, it's going to release energy. So when we release that energy, it can be used to maybe form other molecules, right? Your cells are growing, you need to make more cells. Well, we need energy to do that. So that's where the energy goes. And some of that will actually go to heat as well. So we want to maintain our body temperature, our bodily functions. And so we need that as well. So sometimes we use the energy for work, and sometimes that energy goes to heat. Okay, so determine whether the reactions are most likely reversible or irreversible. If you see a reaction and you have this beautiful, beautiful double arrow right here, what are you going to tell me? That is reversible. And moving on, that's that simple. If you see one that only has a regular old arrow, you're going to say irreversible, or E, irreversible. Burning gasoline in an automobile engine. Has anyone ever driven their car and then had more gas in the gas tank? No. So this one is irreversible. Okay, because when you combust the gasoline, you're going to release exhaust, right? Exhaust fumes. Well, you're not getting those back. They're in the environment. They're gone. That's it. They're in the atmosphere. So that is irreversible. Okay. So we're going to move on, and we're going to talk a little more detail about combustion. So when we talk about combustion inside of our bodies, we're talking about organic molecules. So when we say organic molecules, what are we talking about? We're talking about hydrocarbons, right? Hydrocarbons mean hydrogen and carbon. So they're going to react with oxygen. Now, oxygen just doesn't float around as one atom, it floats around in a pair. So it floats around with O2. So you're going to see some formula here that has H's and C's, and it's going to react with oxygen, and it is going to produce, and it is always, always, always going to produce the same thing. It is going to produce water, and it is going to produce carbon dioxide, CO2. So there's our carbon dioxide plus CO2. So combustion reactions tend to be highly exothermic. And so, right, they release a lot of heat. Well, what did we just say about things that release a lot of heat? That's irreversible. So when you combust something, whether it's in your gas tank or it's in your body, it's irreversible. And when we talk about combustion reactions, typically they're decomposition reactions because our hydrocarbons tend to be pretty big, and then we're making a lot of water and carbon dioxide, which are relatively small. But they are also what are called oxidation reduction reactions. And I'm not going to talk about that right now. We're going to talk about that in the next section. So you just have to wait on that one. I know it's going to be hard. All right, so combustion reactions use oxygen. So use oxygen, that means oxygen is a reactant, and it's going to produce energy in the form of heat. So some of that can be used as heating our body, and then some of that energy can be used to perform work, and we'll talk about what that kind of work is. But it's really important to understand how combustion works, whether we're talking about fuel for our bodies or fuel for our vehicles. And so when we do this, remember, because you're going to be writing these reactions, you are always, always, always going to make carbon dioxide and water. And so these are pretty simple reactions and very, very predictable. And so this is a really good place to start looking at organic chemical reactions. So when we look at our organic chemical reactions, we're going to look at some of our functional groups, right? So we talked about alkanes. Remember, alkanes are carbon-carbon single bond molecules. So because they have those single bonds, we generally call them unreactive, but they do undergo combustion. So if we combust an alkane, usually there's a lot of energy stored in those bonds, and they give off that energy when they're burned. And so we use them in our cars. We use them, it's in gasoline, so we use it. But the problem is with our engines inside of our vehicles, we call that internal combustion, right? Our vehicles don't completely react with all the hydrocarbons. So you have some hydrocarbons that have only partially reacted, and then they are sent out into the environment. And it can be really damaging to the environment. And you end up with carbon soot. You end up with bad things in the atmosphere. And so you've probably heard in the news and things like that, that they're trying to develop engines that are clean burning. So what do we mean when we say clean burning? We're talking about the efficiency of combustion. What percent of our hydrocarbon completely combusted? And so the cleaner the fuel that burns, the more complete the combustion. So a perfectly clean burning engine would have 100% complete combustion. But we don't have that. All right. You are going to have to be able to balance chemical equations that have that are combustion reactions. You need to be able to look at a formula and know just right off the bat that is a combustion reaction. So remember that when you have a combustion of a hydrocarbon, how do I know this is a combustion of a hydrocarbon? Well, I have hydrogen and I have carbon, and I'm reacting it with oxygen. So that tells me that this is combustion. Just looking at half of the equation, I know that this is combustion. And you remember, I'm not going to give you this on the exam. You need to remember that combustion of a hydrocarbon produces water and carbon dioxide. So let's go ahead and see how to write this. My big tip for you is when you're balancing these equations, balance your carbons, balance your hydrogens, then balance your oxygens last. Okay? So let's go ahead and do that. CHO, that's the order we're going to go in. We're going to go in CHO. So we know we're going to make, and I'm going to just get rid of my question mark there, because I know maybe I'm going to get rid of it. There we go. Okay. So I know this is a combustion reaction. I know I'm going to produce water and I'm going to produce carbon dioxide. Okay. So I need to look at my carbons first. I have 3 carbons on this side and none on this side. So I'm going to put a 3 in front of my carbon. Let me do that in a different color so it's easier to see. So I'm going to put a 3 in front of my carbon. So that looks great. My carbons are balanced. Now I want to go to my hydrogens. This hydrogen has 8. This hydrogen has 2. That's not going to be enough, right? So how do I increase this side to 8? I'm going to put a 4. Now I want to look at my oxygens. If I total up my oxygens, on this side I only have 2 right here. But on this side I have 4 here, plus I have 3 times 2 is 6. 4 plus 6 is 10. So how can I get 10 on both sides? If I put a 5 here, 5 times 2 is 10. So 10 is equal to 10, so it's good. Double check and look through and make sure that all your atoms are balanced. Okay. All right. Oh, and we gotta go do problems now, right? Oh, no. This is still, we're still doing other chemical reactions. All right, so when we do, the cool thing about reactions that occur inside of the body, right, for organic reactions, we want to know how the things that are attached to our carbon chain change. So sometimes it's the chain itself that changes, and sometimes it's the functional group sitting on the outside that gets changed. So the reason you're going to see most of our organic chemical equations, chemical reactions drawn out with the molecules is so that we can see the structural changes that occur inside of the reaction. So here's an example. We have an alkene, right? We have a double bond, carbon-carbon double bond. So we know that's an alkene right there. And now it's going to undergo a chemical reaction. So we said we could put our catalyst either above or below the arrow, and it's saying that it's catalyzing these reactions. And we're looking at our product. Our product is an alkane because we have a carbon-carbon single bond here. But what you also have to know about these organic reactions is there are other reactants that are required to make this process go. But in an organic reaction, we tend to put small molecules that are still reactants. So small molecule reactants right above the arrow because we're not really worried about those molecules so much. What we're really worried about is the hydrocarbon. What's going on in the hydrocarbon? Look at the structure. How does it change? And so just kind of be a little careful about that and understanding that if it's a catalyst, it doesn't actually change, but other things, small molecules and things like that are actually reactants and can change. But you could also have a delta, right, for heat, a change in heat. Things like that can be up there. There are a few different things that it could be. All right, so we have regular chemical equations, right? We wrote out our molecular formula. We said NaCl plus water goes to, right, whatever. Then you have your organic reactions where we're drawing out the structure and we're looking at what changes, right? Now, our third kind of a reaction is a biochemical reaction. We write them just like we said for organic. We write the reaction, we write the product, and we write whatever other things are important. But what's really interesting about biochemical reactions is a lot of biochemical reactions inside of the body are non-spontaneous. They don't happen by themselves. And so how can we make these reactions favorable inside of the body? Well, you can't. But what you can do is you can couple two reactions together. And if you have one reaction that's unfavorable and one reaction that's favorable, and you put them together, one can drive the other. So a lot of times what you're going to see is that our biochemical reactions are coupled to ATP hydrolysis. I'm hoping you've heard of ATP before in like your biology class. So you have adenosine triphosphate. So the tri is telling you how many phosphate groups you have. It's not a phosphorus atom. It is a phosphate group. Phosphate groups are a phosphorus atom, and then it has hydrogen, and it says, oxygens attached to it. So that's a phosphate group, a phosphorus with oxygens. So when the ATP is hydrolyzed, is broken apart, what you're going to produce is a DP. So this is adenosine diphosphate. Di meaning you have two. So tri means three, di means two. And it is understood, but a lot of times not written, that you have, and they call it PI, they call it an inorganic phosphate group. So it doesn't have any carbon in it. That's why they call it inorganic phosphate. So you have that ADP plus your inorganic phosphate. And so that's where your tri, you had three before, Now you're making a product that has 2 and you're releasing a free phosphate. That reaction happens spontaneously and releases energy, and we can use it to drive the chemical reactions that we need to happen in the body that aren't necessarily favorable. So when we write this, we usually write the 2 reactions together. And the energy that comes from ATP, we write it to where it's a curved arrow. It meets our normal reaction arrow and then makes our ADP. And so that's where the energy comes from, this conversion. So this provides energy to drive our reaction here, in this case, to convert from glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. And in this diagram, we're also told that we have, what's that? A catalyst. And this catalyst is an enzyme. Most enzymes end in ASE, so kinase, hexakinase is an enzyme. Typically, if it ends in ASE, it's an enzyme. Okay, so we said there are 3 kinds of reactions. A general chemical reaction, where we show the chemical formula only, and then we can have that yield arrow either going only one way, or we can have it going both ways. And you have it balanced, so you know your number of moles, you know your reactants, you know your products, right? That's our general. So we did in like chapter 1. Then our second kind of chemical reaction is an organic reaction. Now remember, in organic, we're worried about the structure. So we want to pay very close attention to the structure of our organic molecule. You do have an arrow, so you can tell something about reversibility. You're also given information about other small reactants that participate and conditions. So our conditions could be temperature, they could be a catalyst, right? Things like that. So what are we worried about for an organic reaction? A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times we're looking at changes in the functional group. And then our last type is a biochemical reaction, where you do, again, draw the structure, because we're very worried about the structure. You also have your yield arrow, so you're told if it's reversible, you're told if there's an enzyme, right, or a catalyst, or a reaction condition, something like that. But what's specific to a biochemical reaction is coupling. So it will tell you if it is coupled or not. So that's a really important one for a biochemical reaction. And the most common coupled reaction is with ATP. So a lot of times we are paying attention in this group to functional groups, but really we're also looking at energy coupled reactions. Okay. All right, and that's it. So let's go do some problems. So here are our problems, our in-class problems. We're going to start with our odd, 5.21. Characterize the following reactions as synthesis, decomposition, or exchange reactions in the forward direction. All right, so we're assuming that all of these reactions are going in the forward direction. So they are going from reactants to products. They're not going to go back the other way. So let's give ourselves a general definition of what we are looking for in each of the 3. So if you are looking for something in a synthesis reaction, an example of a synthesis reaction, right? You're making something. It's A plus B goes to AB. So what we're looking for is one product. One product. Decomposition. Decomposition is the opposite. We go from AB to A plus B. So in this case, we're going to have one reactant. Now, in an exchange reaction, you're actually going to see components flip-flop and switch who their partner is in the equation, right? So we said it could be A, B plus C goes to a C plus B. That's a possibility, right? Where our B and C swapped, or we could go AB plus CD goes to AD plus BC, right? So now we have A and D hanging out, and we have B and C hanging out, right? So either way is possible. So you should just kind of have your mind set so you know what you're looking for. Because if you don't know what you're looking for, all you're going to be doing is looking at a lot of letters, and it's not going to make any sense to you. So you have to know what you're looking for. So this is super important before you start analyzing your reactions. Okay, so let's look at the first one. What are we looking for? We're looking to figure out what's changing. So what you can do is you can kind of look, all right, CuO. When I compare my reactants to my products, where did my copper go? Here. And where did my oxygen go? Whoa, here. They got split up. I wonder what else happened. Well, I have HCl. Where did my hydrogen go? Here. Where did my chlorine go? Here. So what happened? They've exchanged partners, right? So we can call this an exchange or a displacement. Exchange or displacement. Okay, the next one. Oh, there should be a red flag on this one, right? What do you see on this one? When I look at it, I see a single reactant. That single reactant then gets broken down into two different things. So when I start with one reactant and break that reactant apart into little pieces, that is going to be decomposition. Decomposition. Okay. Now, even though C has our reversible arrow, we're only going to look at this equation going in the forward direction because the instructions told us that. So here, whoa, I have something else that's specific in this one. When I look at this one, I see that I only have one, this is one product. But over here, I have two, or I have multiple reactants. So if I take some little pieces and I hook them together and I make one thing, I'm making that one thing, so this must be synthesis. So if you kind of have an idea of what you should be looking for before you start, you're going to be just fine. Okay. Determine if the reactions are reversible or irreversible. This one is super nice and easy because they gave you the arrows already. So if it's got a double-sided arrow, this one is reversible. These two, on the other hand, the arrow's only going in one direction. So these two are both irreversible. Okay. All right, let's see. Oh, here's a combustion. All right. Write the products and balance the following reaction for the complete combustion of ethane. So remember, even if I don't tell you that this is combustion, you have to recognize that it's combustion. You have to. So we have a hydrocarbon, carbon and hydrogen, and it is being reacted with oxygen. So what are you going to produce? You always produce, right? If you have a hydrocarbon plus oxygen, you're always going to produce CO2 plus H2O, okay? So let's balance our chemical equation here. So let's see, I'm going to get rid of my question mark. Okay, now I can write. All right, so I'm going to make water, and water is going to be a liquid, plus I'm going to make CO2, and CO2 is a gas. Okay, so when I look at this, I want to balance my carbons first. Remember our order to balance is CHO, okay? So I want to look at my carbons first. This carbon has 2, this carbon has 1. So if I just put a 2 here, let me put a different color, a 2 here, now our carbons are balanced. Now I want to look at hydrogens. So on this side, I have 6 hydrogens. On this side, I have 2 hydrogens. So how am I going to get this side up to 6? I need to multiply by 3. Okay. Now, I need to look at my oxygens. On this side, I have 2. On this side, I have 3 plus 2 times 2 is 4. 3 plus 4 is 7. You have to use whole number coefficients. There's no way that I can put a whole number in front of my O2 right here and get the number 7. So what you do if that happens is you just take everything and multiply it by 2. Okay, so let me show you what that means. Let me erase some of this stuff that's kind of at the bottom so it looks a little bit cleaner. Okay, so I'm going to take this whole thing and I'm going to multiply this whole thing by 2, so times 2, okay? So what do I end up with? I end up with 2C2H6 plus 2. Well, you don't have to really worry about your oxygens. Let's not worry about our oxygens yet, because this is kind of an unknown. We don't know what this number is going to be. O2 yields 3 times 2 is 6, H2O, and I'm not worried about the gaseous and liquid because I'm just rewriting for coefficients. Then here, 2 times 2 is 4, so I get 4 CO2. So now, can I balance it? So double check and make sure your carbons work. Carbon, 2 times 2 is 4. Over here, 4 times 1 is 4, so carbon's good. Now I'm looking at hydrogens. Hydrogen on this side is 6. Hydrogen, oh, I'm sorry, 6 times 2, which is 12. On this side, hydrogen, we have 6 again times 2, that's 12. Okay, now my oxygens. Right now I only have 2. On this side, I have 6 from here, plus 4 times 2 is 8, so that is 14. So what can I multiply 2 by to get 14? I can multiply by 7, and that gives me 14. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to come up here and change my coefficient here to a 7. So that's my balanced chemical equation. And the other trick is that you can start off, if you know it's combustion of a hydrocarbon, before you do anything, you multiply all your coefficients by 2 and then balance. So either one works perfectly fine, and it doesn't matter to me. So I think that's, oh, and we got one more. Okay. So list the similarities between chemical equations used in organic chemistry and chemical equations used in biochemistry. So we're gonna tell how they're similar. So for both of them, organic and biochemistry. Well, right, in chemical, we just have to write our molecular formula. But in organic and biochemistry, we're really worried about structure, right? So we're gonna have our structure, structure is shown for reactants and products. What else is similar? Well, we're always still going to have our reactants going to products. So we still have this arrow. So we're going to have a yield arrow. And it's going to tell us if this reaction is non-reversible, or you could have something like this, and you would know that that was reversible. So the yield arrow tells reversibility. A-B-I-L-I-T-Y, never was a good speller. Okay, What else do we have? We also not only want to see the structure, but we want to see the changes in the functional groups as well. So we want to see changes in, we'll say, both structure and functional groups. You're going to have to balance them both. Balance both, right? So those kinds of things, those are all similar. And then in class, we will talk about how they are different. And that is the end of the section.